And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share. This is work that I've been doing with colleagues in South Africa, in Senegal, in Cameroon, in Germany, and in the UK. And of course, one of our very dear colleagues, Professor Siraj Rasool from the University of the Western Cape, will be giving the keynote later today. I'm very sad that I cannot be with you due to institutional arrangements and expectations. But I'd like to quickly thank the Transmat team, Grete and Maria, for supporting me and our colleagues through this process and creating this space for us to have this conversation. Now, my thoughts that I'm going to share today are in part significantly inspired by Professor Siraj Rasool's work on restitution as restitutionary work. And I wanted to extend that thinking in this presentation to think about the restitutionary process as labor and as necessary labor, especially in the moment that we are in crafting different worlds. I wanted to also just note that this is part of an ongoing piece of work. So I've been sharing these thoughts and thinking them through the life of the research that we're doing. So I have, hopefully this slideshow is working properly. So I have three brief key elements that I wanted to share. One, of course, being the very premises from which we begin to think about restitution. The second being whether we can also start to think of the work of restitution as labor. And here, of course, I'm thinking about labor as the processes and enactments that we participate in as part of the demand for the production, not just of specific kinds of material life, but of making worlds. And the last I wanted to think about is whether we can, as we are confronted with this very specific historical moment, which, as I often borrow from Stuart Hall, can be regarded as conjunctural, as bringing together very specific political, social, and economic factors to, in a sense, birth a world that looks very different from worlds that we've previously known. So as we are confronted with this sort of, in some sense, a melting world, and in other senses, an overheating world, and in others, a flooding and burning world, what is the task of restitution when notions of culture and institutions of culture, the institutions that are responsible for forging specific kinds of understanding of culture and cultural relations are explicitly under attack, defunded, and the work of making them reflect the world that we live in is also under attack. So what is the work of restitution? Now, if we think, as Professor Siraj Rasool rightly points out, of restitution as if it's the same as repatriation, but also as if it necessarily ends with the return of belongings that were either stolen or acquired in conditions or historical moments of unequal relations, as if that is in total restitution, then we limit the expansive nature of what restitution can become. Although it's important to think with these specific material cultures, belongings that we choose to call objects, it's important for us to extend our conceptualization of restitution to these socioeconomic and political factors that have been, in the first instance, at the foundation of how material enters into what we call collection, either as ethnographic, as archaeological, or as natural history, categories that in many ways are part of a history of taxonomization and sense making that doesn't meet the cosmologies and the worlds that this material has come from. So if we locate restitution within a space where we are not solely interested in a resolve or an end, where we say, we've returned these Benin bronzes, or, we've returned this material to whichever community it was taken from, and so we have done something very good. Then we extend our understanding of the world that were both erased, but also have continuously been made absent and invisible in the present, which of course is to then think about the legacies of destruction of cultures, and of course in the present, the particular forms of marginalization, racism, and of course forms of epistemic, ontological coloniality. The second note that I wanted to think about is, of course, as I said, what Professor Siraj notes on restitution as work. Now, here I'm trying to suggest that these various sort of interconnected forms of necessary labor and infrastructural shifts are important, as I said, in addition to the demand for the return of belongings and other forms of, in our work, African art, sacred belongings, ancestors, and other forms of material culture. So the labor of restitution means we then have to attend to the specific forms of reparation, of restoration, the particular kinds of repair that we might attempt. Because how do you feel a knowledge, a cultural or spiritual gap that was created by centuries of theft, dispossession, and violence? So, in other terms, some of the work that is tried to think through both the specific forms of material culture, ancestors, sacred belongings, and the archives, the films, the specific kinds of knowledge that don't necessarily sit in institutional spaces, in the infrastructures that we live with, what I term in my work infrastructures of containment, become necessary as part of extending this work of restitution. Just to briefly say, I think for this work, what I call infrastructures of containment, because I see the work of culture being done, mobilized, obstructed through specific technologies, tools, the actual buildings, vitrines in museums, the particular structures of power and hierarchy through the history of military incursion and weapons and violence. So these infrastructures, in a sense, are at the foundation and become the modalities through which contemporary life is also lived. I think of them as infrastructures of containment precisely because, in addition to holding in place the material culture and belongings from these different peoples, the task of some of these infrastructures is to also, in a sense, determine the particular forms of mobility of people from these places. And to put it in very, I think, well-known terms, we constantly have conversations about things like visas and travel restrictions, and how historically the material culture, belongings, and sometimes even ancestors from different peoples circulate in ways that those peoples can't. Cultural institutions circulate lawns, they move, kings and queens from places like Egypt across for exhibitionary purposes. But those people from those places face much more stringent restrictions in their mobility in the present. And you begin to recognize the relationship between the colonial and imperial foundations of the building, not just of the infrastructure of the cultural institution as containment, but also the particular kinds of biopolitics and biopower that are brought to, in a way, undergird the way that we both understand and access culture, but the way we also live and inhabit this world. So, in thinking of restitution here as labor, we begin to question the foundations and the legitimacy, not just of cultural institutions that might claim legitimacy through the processes of return, but the limitations of the work that is necessary in trying to fill gaps and to return particular kinds of knowledge and spirit and ancestors to places that in many instances don't exist anymore. So how do you work with fragments, not just fragments of material that has been subject to specific kinds of transformation, but that also exists out of time? How do you actually do the labor of undoing centuries of theft and violence? Now, the last note that I wanted to share, I think I'm hopefully moving okay with the time, is of course on the important work of restitution as part of the work of reshaping planetary relations. I keep coming back to these specific framings because if we think of restitution as something that belongs solely to the space of specific cultural institutions and people, then we divorce it from its specific legacies and the function of cultural institutions, of art, and of re-establishing and rethinking not just cultural relations, but socioeconomic and political relations in the present. Now, I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday who works for a cultural institution in Europe. And one of the things that we kept coming back to is that although a lot of institutions imagine themselves being in control and in charge of the kinds of change that they claim they may want to bring about, and part of that being restitutionary work, the planetary relations have a way in this moment of moving far quicker and ahead of those imaginings. And so the task of rebuilding these planetary relations cannot be performed on a reformatory impulse that wants to, in many ways, keep the status quo of cultural institutions, of notions of culture that we built on the foundations of cultural racism, imperialism, and very specific kinds of hierarchy in the world. A reformatory impulse leaves the work of restitution where those institutions begin, not where they end. In other ways, we might think of the work of abolitionists like Mariam Kaba, who argue very presciently that rather than start by thinking about what we have and how we must reform it, maybe it's important for us to think about the kinds of cultural worlds that we would like to see and begin to work towards those. So I am trying to think of restitution as that labor of trying to build towards very different planetary and cultural relations, not as an end, but as a beginning of the end of particular formations of culture and cultural institutions. And of course, there is no better time to try and evidence the accelerated speed at which our notions of planetary order and hierarchy can begin to be dismantled and to collapse before our own eyes. So in many respects, the specific infrastructures that we inhabit, the specific technologies, tools, forms of epistemology, the spirit with which we have been trained and engineered to approach these questions of culture, cultural institutions, questions of restitution, and the various belongings that arrive in these institutions through histories of exploitation are not adequate for the task of restitutionary work into the future, which, in other words, is to say that restitutionary labor and the task of building different planetary relations necessarily has to exceed the limits of the infrastructures that we've historically inhabited, and that our imaginations cannot labor within the same infrastructures and expect to produce very different results. So just to end quickly, I will recap and say I just wanted to share these 3 quick notes for this conversation as part of extending the very important work that Professor Siraj Rasool has been doing, but also to recognize this work as part of the research we've been doing as a project, Reconnecting Objects at the University of Oxford, with our colleagues in Senegal, in Cameroon, in Germany, and in South Africa. And to also acknowledge the very important work that is done by different colleagues, particularly on the African continent, who are at the forefront of pushing for the reshaping of these relations, not just at the moment of return, but as recognizing that we have to be striving for building very different cultural futures. I think I'll end. Thank you so much.
Hi. Today I'm going to present some of the results from my PhD research that explores Guinea-Bissauan cultural heritage in relation to its past and future. The study was founded by the Portuguese National Foundation for Science and Technology for a period of 4 years between 2020 and 2024, and I've recently submitted my final thesis, which will be publicly presented at the end of this month. So this is going to be the preview. I hope you enjoy. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. Okay, so I set out to study the colonial collections brought from Guinea-Bissau to Portuguese museums during the colonial period. To do this, I formulated 3 main research questions that acknowledge the fragmentary nature of the story of these collections and the need to study and reconstruct them from a shared and transnational perspective between Portugal and Guinea-Bissau. So this historical study includes fieldwork in Guinea-Bissau and with the diaspora, the diaspora in Portugal to understand how Guineans view the their colonial history and how material cultural objects are still part of their daily lives today. I use this video as a metaphor for my research because when we deal with this colonial past in the museum context, we are often concerned with the materiality of the object, its conservation, and the reconstruction of its meaning and social use. This video shows a bombolom community drum. The official history told by museums describes this instrument as something that can only be played by a few selected community members during a very specific practices like funerals. There you can see the drums being played by children in an ordinary morning. So Portugal reality concerning colonial archives and collections is very similar from what I could understand to other European contexts. The materials are dispersed in different institutions, which makes reconstructing the history of these collections quite a difficult task. In my research, I use interviews to fill the gaps found when approaching the archives. My goal was to create a methodology capable of document micro-narratives through informed, community-engaged research. So this methodology presents empirical data that I consider to be representative, although I don't intend to give a conclusive answer that presents Guinea-Bissau position on cultural heritage matter. For this study, I've chosen certain sectors of society, such as cultural and youth, where I believe important voices can be found, both for the reconstruction of country's historical memory and for its future cultural reimagining. The parallels we found in the elections of social actors in Portugal and Guinea-Bissau were deliberate in order to promote a dialogue between the two countries and show the diversity of perspectives found. My study focused mainly around 3 national heritage institutions, which share histories and actors between each other. The Museum of Portuguese Guinea, the Colonial Project, had a direct relation with the National Ethnographic Museum in Portugal, known at those times as Overseas Museum. And even during the post-colonial times, we can find connections between the same museum in Portugal and the Postcolonial Museum in Bissau. As marginal case studies, I also considered the collections from the Geographical Society in Lisbon and the Science Museums, because although they represent different timelines and acquisition politics, they are important as a comparison study, in this study. Once the archival work was finished, I went to Guinea-Bissau to start collecting data about the meaning and value of these objects for today Guinea-Bissauans. As you can see here, the student is holding an image and narrating what he knows about an object that is part of the Portuguese National Ethnographic Museum collection on the left. On the right, you can see an image of a similar object at the Ethnographic Museum of Guinea-Bissau. The following year, 2024, during 2 stays of 2 weeks each in January and May, I proposed various actions on co-creation of knowledge. During my stays, I also promoted capacity building activities for the museum and cultural sector professionals in Guinea-Bissau, housed at the General Secretariat of Culture. In 2021, I also did it at the National Ethnographic Museum in Lisbon with diaspora groups composed by university students. So here are some opinions I've collected. I conducted focus group activities in the storerooms of National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon where I was able to gather a variety of opinions from the diaspora students. The discussions revealed the tension that exists between young people who want to preserve their culture in one hand and who are open to the importance of Western culture in their daily lives on the other. Here we can read the statement from a student in Guinea-Bissau speaking about the importance of having Guinea-Bissauan culture shown in Western museums. So she says that conservation in European countries is very good because not only Guineans but also Europeans and Americans have access to learning about Guinea-Bissau. And she stresses that in Guinea-Bissau they don't have conditions to preserve their heritage. So this dimension of preservation is very, very important for them still. So it's inherited from the colonial period, but it's still very important. And on the other hand, other university students from Guinea-Bissau stressed the importance of returning these objects to the country in order to deepen their knowledge about history of the country. So as a way of transmitting and have accessibility to Guinean, so that Guinean people have accessibility to their culture and education, and recognizing that if young people doesn't know their culture, they are not able to, for fighting for their own country, and they don't know. He says they don't know their history. So now, regarding the scene of the National Museum in Guinea-Bissau, there is only one national museum for the whole country. There are several small museums around the country, but only one national museum. The National Ethnographic Museum of Guinea-Bissau is constantly reinventing itself. It started as a post-colonial project, inheriting some of objects from the Colonial Museum of Portuguese Guinea, and acquiring other with support of international organizations after independence in '74. So the museum was created with the aim, and I quote, to collect, study, conserve, and disseminate the material culture of different groups that make up the Guinean society. It operated from '88 until '98 civil war, which devastated the museum, as well as many other archives and cultural institutions. Despite multiple reopening attempts in the year 2000, it only reopened in 2017 through a curatorial project in which I was involved, closing again in 2021 when the building was repurposed for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Currently, the museum remains again in storage, awaiting for a suitable space to reopen. So these are the conditions that the museum has. When comparing the collections from the National Museum of Ethnology and the National Ethnographic Museum in Guinea-Bissau, both museums focused on mostly on the acquisition of Bijagok culture, as it is the case of many European museums I visited during my research. Nalu culture takes the second place in terms of importance for politics of representation, as you can see in the pictures shown that I showed there. While the Lisbon Museum has a total of 2,000 objects, Guinea-Bissau Museum has only less than 200. So it's good to have this comparison. Here are the results that I did. that I collected from January 23 until May 24. So culture is not a priority. The most important current event is the Carnival. A museum is a place of culture that preserves historical and artistic objects. Between an ethnographic art museum or communitary museum, the respondents said that an art and ethnographic museum is necessary to showcase the cultural ethnic diversity. So the importance given to ethnic division varies, and some prefer to exalt the national identity. The responses emphasize the importance of having objects of the Western culture in their daily lives. They value the traditional culture. And so the museum, in the museum context, the ethnographic museums, the ethnographic objects are more important than the art objects. The majority, and you can read, so, okay, but here are the results. So the majority considers the presence of objects in Western museums to be positive. Opinions on restitution varies, but all agree that conditions have to be made before objects return. In terms of material culture, they value the most sculpture and weaving. The majority sees music and dance as the most important way of representing culture and expressing themselves. In terms of statuary, public statuary, they would pay homage to Amilcar Cabral and former combatants of national liberation struggle. They are not all, this is not all, but they are mostly against the destruction of colonial statuary, because they think it's a way of remembering the past, because at the same time they recognize that they are not able of maintaining institutions of memory as museums and libraries and archives, so they, in a certain sense, like to have the colonial statuary still. And they see, they see African art as a way of making living and enhancing their art and heritage abroad. So these are very general conclusions from this survey. In January 24, I came back to present and discuss again with all my participants the results I obtained from this research. And I put this image here with the permission from the student, just because I like the contrast between, and it's very common to see this contrast between the references of Western culture with Nike and other brands, and then the traditional textiles. And all my activities were filmed, so I have all these testimonies recorded of them talking about it. Okay, so in the heritage context, the reparation of the colonial past in Guinea-Bissau depends on the reactivation of international cooperation programs that promote the creation of infrastructure and the training of professionals for them. They recognize, they think this. Museum objects are not the ones that are best known and appreciated by civil society, which sees forms of embodied heritage, those that are carried on the body and activated through it, as the cultural manifestations that allow Guinea-Bissau to present itself abroad and gain visibility. Forms of embodied heritage include music, dance, language, and textiles weaving. So on my last trip to Guinea-Bissau in February of this year, so last month, I visited 3 Nalu villages where I could speak, or I spoke, to elected members of the communities about the objects of their culture that are in museums in Portugal. To do that, I took pictures of the objects, as I did throughout the other activities. I asked them if they were still in use, the objects, and what they would like to do with them. The objects are still in use in only one village. Also, only one village prefers the creation of a national museum to the return of the objects to their village of origin. So only one of the 3 prefers the creation of a national museum instead of creating local museums. Most of them believe that the objects should return to the place where they were produced and used in order to be preserved. In order to determine the provenance, they propose setting up meetings with elected members between villages to define where the objects should return to. So they would create these meetings with different villages and decide where an Intekamachual should go to, where an Imba should go to, and so on. And thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd really like to thank the organisers of the conference for allowing me to present. So I'll just begin. So I'm going to talk about the access to justice, the restitution of cultural heritage back to communities, and to put this presentation into context, I'm particularly going to focus on an examination of international and domestic laws. I'm a human rights lawyer that specialises in heritage protection. So this is the link to the research repatriation division. If anyone wants to talk to me, I have a team of very keen researchers. We're all lawyers, so and we're happy to research laws, assist communities, and aid and support the restitution movement. So, moving on, my research is global. It's not particularly based on the African continent, but I happen to live in Tanzania. So I'm British, but I fell in love with East and West Africa 12 years ago, and I haven't really left. So obviously my research is influenced by the continent. I've checked this map out. I was pretty sure someone would hold me to account and say it's incorrect. I think it's a 1910 map from London, so I haven't had time to research every detail of it, but I'm sure somebody might put me right, and that would be fair to do so if it's incorrect. But basically, I'm talking, the theme of my presentation is colonial power, colonial laws, and they're still with us. So the repatriation call, which you're all aware of, but to set it into context, communities including indigenous peoples, former colonized peoples in Africa, Asia, and Australasia are increasingly making requests for returns of their cultural heritage, which includes their ancestors' human remains. My PhD was all totally human remains and trying to find a legal framework for return. And I talk about cultural harm a lot in my work, and I've included it there. So I'm a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. So one huge observation I've made over the years is I don't see equal access to justice in relation to the restitution, the repatriation movement. So the paper I've written for the conference, in the abstract, I say this paper argues that the trickle of returning cultural heritage back to states, indigenous peoples, and local communities falls short of the legal principle of access to justice. Framing the debate on the restitution of cultural heritage within the principle of access to justice brings the law into play in relation to disputes over the restitution of cultural heritage. Equal access to justice has been said to be the most basic human right of a modern egalitarian legal system. What does access to justice mean? Access to justice means that individuals have access to and can make effective use of existing judicial or quasi-judicial mechanisms to protect their rights and obtain redress in response to violations. This can include access to informal institutions such as customary frameworks, quasi-judicial alternative dispute mechanisms. The International Commission of Jurists affirms that all persons, groups and peoples must be able to access justice effectively at the national and international levels. What does access to justice mean in the context of cultural heritage? The United Nations report of the independent expert in the field of cultural rights on access to cultural heritage as a human right highlights that states should make available effective remedies, including judicial remedies. And she merely reiterates my previous slide. And then we have another United Nations study carried out solely in relation to indigenous peoples, access to justice and the protection of the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, emphasises that remedies and access to remedies are essential. So this is how I've contextualised how I feel inside about the domestic laws of former colonial powers and also international public law. There is no such thing as culturally neutral law. The domestic laws of former colonial powers and international law in general have countered the narratives of indigenous peoples and former colonised peoples in relation to ownership of their property and cultural heritage. Moreover, judicial decisions can help to expose discrimination, but judicial decisions can also perpetuate discrimination. Also, participation in making the laws of particularly indigenous peoples, they haven't had full participation, and also you can reflect on the communities within the states requesting cultural heritage back to their communities. You know, how much participation have they had in their domestic laws and in the international legal system? So I emphasize this, and I've heard it a lot over the past few days. Most requests from communities are handled between states. This places indigenous peoples and communities as the other. They're outside of decision-making, the decision-making process. Okay, that's a generalization. Maybe you'll come to me and say, yes, these communities participate, but in many circumstances, they are the other. So I like to use, I'm a white European, okay? So in my work, I like to, if I can, use the voice of indigenous peoples or community voices, So this is the work of an Aboriginal scholar in Australia, and she has reflected on the laws that her people have to use to claim land, and we can talk in the same language about cultural heritage. Tragically and ironically, even though we were dispossessed of our lands by white people, the burden of proof for repossession of our lands is now placed on us, and it must be demonstrated in accordance with white legal structure in the courts, controlled by predominantly white men, as the written word is generally regarded as more realistic by the courts. All claimants must be able to substantiate their oral histories with documents, and I think most of you will agree that this happens in restitution, let's say, applications as well. Basically, what I've done here, I've used a well-known African scholar who has, and he said this a very, very long time ago, that he noted that there is more African cultural property outside of the continent than within. So the following research, which I've included in this presentation, was requested by the AAIA, I'll try and get this right, the Association of American Indian Affairs. So we carried out the division that I'm leading, and the team, we carried out quite a vast piece of research in relation to the laws totally requested by this organisation of Germany, France, the UK. I've added Spain because there's something interesting there, and Switzerland. We haven't got time to dissect all the laws, but basically the following slides show that these countries are signed up to the fundamental international human rights treaties, the fundamental heritage treaties. They have a range of laws in all the states that we looked at. However, unfortunately, we didn't find, because what we were searching for as a legal team, gaps or places in the laws that we could use to restitute cultural heritage or advise the organisation how they could use these laws. So anyone's welcome to the slides, but so basically France, I've noticed, and some people here will know the name of the organisation I think they're based in Kenya. I saw that they said 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And if you look at the laws in relation to the former colonial powers, especially in France, promises, and not much action except in one sector, and I'll highlight that sector going through. If you look at the United Kingdom, so France, you can say 1 step forward, 2 steps back. If you look at the UK, there are some good examples of restitution, but I'm not looking at good examples. Native Americans, the biggest organisation have told me their mantra is everything back. They want everything back. That's different on the African continent. But in the UK, it's, even if you're a highly qualified lawyer, you'd struggle with the laws in the UK. I mean, we're a common law system, and the museum landscape is complicated. So it's a difficult landscape. Germany, not much to help in relation to repatriation, restitution. Legally, they've initiated this German contact point for colonial context. I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but for me, it just seems like a hurdle, another hurdle that communities have to maneuver over, round, however you describe it. Switzerland was never a colonial power, but it had a role to play in collecting. But one very interesting thing about Switzerland is the large number of bilateral agreements, which aren't legal, they're not law, but they're like a contract. So they've been returning, and I've got examples, quite a few here. They've been returning heritage back to these countries because they, through diplomacy, I suppose, not law, diplomacy. Spain, I've mentioned here. Great, they've instituted all the EU directives on heritage, but they only protect their own heritage and the heritage of other European Union countries. However, I had a Chilean student researching this. She found that there have been lots of restitutions, and there's the website there. So I've already written about this area and published, and we're time constrained, which is fine, but I'm going to now, I think, focus on a human rights approach and see in some way how human rights obligations, these states have signed up to human rights treaties. There's not an enforcement mechanism, but it still might put pressure on states to start returning. How am I doing for time? Okay, so heritage laws, which you're probably familiar with. Challenges, you can add many more here, but I want to focus on the discrepancy in the laws in most of the former colonial powers. They've been quite happy to restitute the property of Jewish peoples, but not colonial peoples. Yes, I know there's good practice in some museums, and I'm not dismissing that, but I'm using here the words of Sherry Hutt. She's a Native American academic, and she wrote this article. I really like this article. She said, if Geronimo was Jewish, equal protection and the cultural property rights of Native Americans. So there isn't equal access to justice even between communities. So, strategic litigation, what am I talking about? And I have to be honest here, communities don't like my idea about strategic litigation, because going as far as confronting a nation's legal system is difficult. But a dimension of access to justice relates to overcoming long-standing historical injustices and discrimination, including the continuing cultural harm caused by colonialism. Strategic human rights litigation offers an avenue to access to justice. The main strategy, briefly, is to cause a ripple effect. And I think that's my personality as well. Don't go in showing the guns. Just keep slowly pushing and try and cause a ripple. This is a scenario where strategic litigation was used in the UK, and it worked. It was an injunction and a Tasmanian community against the National History Museum. If you want the presentation, we can get it to you. So what's all this about? Restorative justice. I've talked about the law, access to justice. Repatriation contributes to restorative justice. Restorative justice is a way of healing wounds and moving on to the path of reconstruction and reconciliation for individuals and communities. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for a really rich set of presentations. My question goes to Fiona. I was really interested in this restitution, sorry, I'm over here, in the restitution sort of center that you manage at Bristol. And I was wondering what that actually looks like and if you provide legal advice essentially to community groups, how it works to actually support communities going through this, and particularly if you support international communities. Thanks.
Basically, we have the resources to do a lot more than we're doing. We've worked for one organisation, and presently I think our work is complete with them at the moment. So we're looking for more collaborations, communities to work with and assist. Yes, our focus is law. How it works is I'm the lead, and every year I get a new group of postgraduates, and depending on their linguistic abilities, because it's great because it's an international university, we're able to research laws from all around the world. I mean, we've been doing research, some Chinese students actually have been doing some research for me. So that's why I'm encouraging people. I'm sure there are communities or even individuals that we could assist with research and even go further than research. That's my ultimate plan. Actually, even though we're not museum experts, we're lawyers, and I'm sure we could assist communities through the process of making requests, but, you know, being behind the scenes. I don't know if that helps.
Hello. Okay. My question is for Anna. Just in regards to some of the research findings that you were summarizing, I just wanted to ask, I think it was the first point, you said culture is not a priority. Could you expand on what you meant by this? Because it was quite short and succinct, but then in later you were talking about like dance and music as like expressions. But just that first point was, I was very curious to hear more about, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I used, I don't know how this works, okay. So I used the term culture in a very generous way in this sense, because it was the first question of the questionnaire or the survey. But what I meant by that is that Guinea-Bissau is a very, very poor country. So when you don't have schools, when you don't have, I don't know, when you don't have electricity, when you don't have water, so of course culture is not a priority for the government. That's the main issue here. So, and then my final argument is that, well, you don't have the museums, you don't have the institutions of memory working as you can see here in the West, But you have another kinds of embodied heritage going on, such as music, dance, carnival, and the textiles that they just put on and they go abroad with it and they are very proud of them. And yeah, I don't know if I make it clear.
You. My name is Kim Grote, Musical Instruments Museum, Markneukirchen, Germany. I got a question for Anna as well. I'm neither proficient in the native community structures of Guinea-Bissau nor in the politics, but you got two interesting thoughts in your field research. The one is seeing objects in foreign museums as some kind of cultural advertising, or let's say cultural ambassadors. On the other hand, the point of view, as long as there are no proficient facilities for preserving and also for demonstrating their own objects, they shouldn't be yet returned. Interestingly, in Germany, mostly the opponents of restitution are having this point of view or this argument, but of course then from a post-colonial, quite arrogant European point of view. And my question is, the Nula community, which you did your research in, is this community like representative for the whole of Guinea-Bissau on the one hand, on the other hand, official politics, which are their talking points? Are they similar to the one you...
Okay, so I worked mainly in the city of Guinea-Bissau. So I had to select the groups with which I interviewed, and I got in contact with more or less 100 people, very largely, with different methods, but I got the opinions of 100 people, more or less. But it's very difficult to enter the government or to enter into politics. So the near, I guess it's like this. The easiest way I got was to get into the direct, how do you call it? The direct Secretariat of Culture, so the main structure. And in there I talked with the main people that are in charge of deciding these things, these matters. And then I arranged these meetings with professionals of culture, mainly curators or professionals of museums, and then also ballet dancers and other kinds of people that are working in the cultural field. But it's quite difficult to get the official narrative in terms of what to do when you are talking about restitution to Guinea-Bissau. That's why I said this is a perspective, not the final answer. When you say this idea of objects being the ambassadors, and also this other idea of the objects having to have, I guess it's like this, having to have conditions to return. This is the general opinion of the civil society, or when we are talking of students in one hand, and also with the museum professionals. And I can say it again because I have all of my activities were filmed, and the way I conducted the interviews was quite open. So all the materials will have in the future the links for the videos. So I have the proofs that they think like this.
To add what Anne is saying, Anna, let me tell you, I have made a film in Guinea-Bissau, long-term film. 3 filming time between 88 and 90. I restituted the film to a film of 90 minutes, 60 millimeter, in Creole and Fula. In 92, it is a time nobody speaks about restitution. We did it. There is no way to find these films anymore. We give it to the director of the Film Institute. In between, Senegal troops passed by there and destroyed everything. Nobody knows. In the place where these films are, it is very badly smelling and nobody finds these rolls. So just to support what she's telling, there is really no condition. This is really true. But what would be interesting to understand, there are a lot of Guinea-Bissau communities in Portugal. And I would like to understand from your experience, because of your very interesting research, what you did, do they have access to the objects in Guinea-Bissau? Do they, in Portugal, do they have possibility to reappropriate the culture through these reserves? Did you find something out?
Okay, so yeah, so I did 6 activities with groups of students in the National Museum in Lisbon. But what I realized is that the Guineans that usually go to the museum have very high already levels of studying in this sense, so they are part of the elite. So it's quite difficult to give access to students, to Guinean students in Portugal, also because for them to study, they have to also work. So they are not able to go to the museum in the normal schedule of the museum, let's say. So all of this makes the access very complicated because the storerooms are not open in the weekends, for instance. So it was quite complicated to get access to the objects. And there is no object from Guinea-Bissau at the permanent exhibition in Lisbon. That's a note, only a note, but that's...
And the last question?
The general remark, I feel uncomfortable when we are talking so judgmentally about people from Guinea-Bissau. I don't feel happy about it, but my questions are for Fiona and for Anna. For Fiona, you said that communities do not like my idea of strategic litigation.
Yeah.
My question is, why do you push them for it? And one of the reasons for them probably not to like it is the expenses. And why do you not favor more alternative dispute resolution? That's one question. The second question is for you about the non-aligned movement. At the end, you concluded there is a causal relationship between what the non-aligned movement was doing in terms of the restitution. And I wonder, because if you think, for instance, of the UN resolution of 1973 of Mobutu, he was relating to Africa and not to the non-aligned movement. And again, if you think about the 1978 speech of Amadou Mambao, same, he was mostly talking about Africa. So could you explain more about that causal relationship?
The one group that really didn't like the idea of strategic human rights litigation, without disclosing the group, it's going to be difficult. They're a group within a state. They don't take the state's funding deliberately so they can be independent. But I think I didn't push it because I knew it was a difficult question for them. But I think they thought it would be too confrontational. Not to maybe confront a museum abroad, but too confrontational to start something like that within the state they were living in. And I think mediation and the bilateral agreements and alternative dispute resolution are all good paths to follow. I suppose law's my discipline. I know alternative dispute resolution is part of the legal framework, but I don't think enough people are exploring the legal area, so that's what I'm doing. It's not that I don't accept that there are other paths to restitution. I think there's a gap in research in relation to law.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.